Feedback from Symposium Workshop. During the Symposium Workshop, participants were asked a series of questions in order to expand on information received during the consultations. These questions included: should legislation have a definition of disability? Why or why not? Keeping in mind the shared responsibility of government, private sector, and community partners, as well as rural-urban differences, what does legislation need to have to ensure a shared responsibility approach to enforcement? What are the priority areas for the development of standards? How should government ensure ongoing community engagement and the development of standards? How often should legislation and standards be reviewed? Definition of disability. As part of the Symposium Workshop, the Planning Committee asked whether legislation should contain a definition of disability. There was no firm consensus from the group at the Symposium Workshop on whether or not to include a definition of disability. There was a general agreement that having a definition of disability that uses medical language, such as disease and treatments, must be avoided. Identified advantages of including a definition in the legislation: can help create clear standards that solve identified barriers appropriately. If we can name it, it is more tangible to solve it. A definition is important, especially when there are human rights appeals and complaints. We need a definition in order to have enforcement and give teeth to the standards. A definition should follow already existing definitions provided in the Convention and the Accessible Canada Act. Identified disadvantages of including a definition in the legislation are: once a definition is made, it will limit the legislation and can be hard to update or change. A strict definition could turn into a culture of negative beliefs very quickly in small communities. A specific definition could create new barriers and exclusion. A shared responsibility approach to enforcement. During the Symposium Workshop, participants gave feedback on how to ensure a shared responsibility approach to enforce the proposed legislation. Some participants thought that the enforcement is only a government responsibility. Others suggested a shared responsibility between various stakeholders that could provide creative solutions to address a range of needs and demographics across the province. Additional comments provided by participants include: legislation needs to have a shared responsibility approach. Legislation must be enforced by government. Shared responsibility is a way to create inclusion from a collaborative approach. Specific roles need to be defined and put in place to enforce the legislation. This could include strategic plans and accessibility plans. It is important to have innovative ideas and answers from all communities. For example, ensuring there is no limit on community population sizes because the province has a large range of rural communities. Community needs to play a role in communicating on what the legislation should do. Provide an accessibility plan template to outline required responsibilities. Defined roles and responsibilities for accountability should be included within the legislation. The Department of Education should provide yearly reports as a mechanism of enforcement to show what complaints they have received and how they have been resolved. This will provide accountability. Priority areas for standards. Enabling legislation would allow for the development of standards. In no particular order, participants identified the following priority areas for the development of standards: customer service, universal design, access to justice, accessibility accommodation during incarceration, education, deaf culture, standards recognizing sign language, ASL, LSQ, ISL, accessible procurement, transportation, information and communication, assistive technology, design of public spaces, human resource-based education, and sensitivity training. Developing and reviewing standards. Participants were asked their thoughts on how government should develop and review standards. The feedback provided included: there should be more consultations for the development and review of standards. It is important to finalize the legislation immediately. Legislation and standards should be reviewed regularly and be an ongoing process. The review process should be every 3 to 5 years. Community engagement and communication. There was a strong message that government must continue to engage with individuals with lived experience throughout the consultation, design, development, implementation, and evaluation stages. Individuals echoed the importance that ongoing feedback must be accessible and be promoted through proper communication channels, and that opportunities are provided for ongoing feedback on the proposed legislation and standards to support its effectiveness. Participants identified the following areas of engagement and communication: in-person meetings, mailouts, online opportunities, ASL, text messaging, and the use of social media with a dedicated government staff to monitor and address questions. Plain and clear language must be used, and no jargon and abbreviations. Government website must be user-friendly and accessible to ensure communication on legislation and ongoing feedback is accessible. There must be transparency of the whole process. Community groups need to be fully engaged within their own communities to circulate information to their members and public. Engagement should be promoted through the Minister's Office, members' offices, and Indigenous governments and organizations, including Nunatsiavut, Nunatuavut, and the Innu Nation. Mechanisms for accountability. Participants expressed a strong need to ensure accountability and the ways to ensure ongoing progress. Suggestions included: create a position of the accessibility advocate, similar to the child and youth advocate. Form a separate entity within government to manage feedback on the legislation, standards, and complaints of enforcement. Have the Disability Policy Office as a separate entity from the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development to strengthen its role horizontally across government as a center of expertise. Make sure there is a requirement to review the proposed legislation regularly. Create municipal accessibility advisory committees with reporting structures. Increase public awareness and confidence by having reports by the Auditor General or similar figure. Consider creating an ombudsman position to investigate complaints. Have more engagement opportunities with the public. Incorporate the role of champion, ambassador, and the promotion of accessibility legislation as part of the Disability Policy Office. Role of Provincial Advisory Council for the inclusion of persons with disabilities. Council's mandate is to advise the minister responsible on disability-related issues. Within their mandate, Council can ensure accountability in the development and review of legislation. One method, suggested by various participants, is to establish committees which will report to Council on development of the standards. Council and community can effectively share information across the province by a network. An example, network of disability organizations. The inclusion of all voices. Every voice needs to be included in the ongoing feedback. Youth, Indigenous governments, organizations, cultural groups, all age ranges, genders, and minorities, in order to recognize the connected and varying experiences with all disabilities. All voices from people who have disabilities must be valued and included in legislation and ongoing feedback. The deaf community shared valuable insight on lack of available services for people who are deaf. Examples include, but are not limited to, lack of sign language interpretation in government public announcements, services, resources, and the lack of support for students who are deaf.